Welcome to Unpacking Peanuts, the podcast where three cartoonists take an in-depth look at the greatest comic strip of all time, Peanuts by Charles M. Schulz.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. It's Unpacking Peanuts. I'm your host, Jimmy Gownley, and I'm so excited to be here today. We have a really special guest. We have a really special show. We have a really special conversation all lined up just for you. Are you good? I hope you're good. We're here in Peanuts world, so we're all doing really well. I'm Jimmy Gownley. If you know me from anything other than this podcast, you might know me from my graphic novel series, Amelia Rules, my memoir, The Dumbest Idea Ever, or my latest book, which is out now from Scholastic, 7 Good Reasons Not to Grow Up. Joining me are my co-hosts. He's a playwright. He's a composer, both for the band Complicated People, as well as this podcast. And he's the cartoonist behind such great creations as Strange Attractors, Tangled River, and A Gathering of Spells. It's Michael Cohen.
Hey there.
And the executive producer and writer of the fantastic hit TV series Mystery Science Theater 3000. The former vice president of Archie Comics and the current creator of the Instagram strip Sweetest Beasts, Mr. Harold Buchholz.
Hello.
Guys, are you excited? Can you feel it? It's a special day today. We have a guest. We have a guest in studio with us. I would like all of you Peanuts people out there to help me welcome to the show Alexis Fajardo. Alexis is a cartoonist of lifelong dedication. His comic book creation, Kid Beowulf, began as a zine in the early part of this century. But it's since grown into a multi-volume graphic novel depicting the life of the title character in the years leading up to the epic poem. He is an Eisner Award-winning editor, a member of the National Cartoonist Society, a juror for the National Scholastic Writing Awards, and if that's not enough, he is the editorial director at Charles M. Schulz Creative Associates. Lex, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on. That sounds all lovely. I didn't know I did all that stuff. But
you did all that, and you have 2 books out right now, 2 newish books, right?
Yes. Well, as awful as the pandemic was for those of us who are creatives, it gave us an excuse to hunker down and get some work done. So I guess I'm thankful for that. But yes, I got 2 new books out.
That is fantastic, and I want to hear all about them. But before that, like, one of the exciting things for me with this whole enterprise of rereading Peanuts is I just wanted to talk to cartoonists, and I wanted to talk to my friends, and I wanted to talk to them about how this amazing work of art affected them in their lives. So you have been working on Kid Beowulf in one form or another for over 20 years. So tell me, what is your cartoonist origin story? Starting with what are your earliest memories of something comics related?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I think the breakfast table, eating my Cheerios and reading the daily newspaper, the comics section in particular, that was a daily ritual. And of course, Peanuts was in the paper. And I grew up in the 80s, which was the heyday, if you remember, for some great strips. The Far Side, Peanuts, Calvin and Hobbes, Bloom County, so that's sort of where my first education really was. I mean, truthfully, there was never a time when Peanuts did not exist, because even prior to me reading, I had a Snoopy plush, and we had the specials. So, and I think my very first drawings were of Snoopy and Charlie Brown. I distinctly remember in elementary school, I did a very crude drawing of Charlie Brown getting knocked down by the baseball and the clothes flying all over the place. But the art teacher liked it and put it up on the wall, and that was my first glimpse of what potential fame could be like. And from then on, it's like I was hooked. Exactly, yeah. So comic strips were really where it began, and I, for a very long time, prior to me doing graphic novels, I wanted to be a syndicated comic strip artist, and that was really my formative years were there. I did dip into comic books. Became a lifelong fan of Spider-Man, and then the other big influence would have been, I think I was 9 years old, and a family friend gave me a copy of Asterix the Legionary, and Asterix is a great French comic album, and immediately that was sort of the first glimpse of like seeing something that, I'd never seen before, and just wanted to know, like, what is this? Who drew this? How does this work? And I just devoured all of those Asterix books, and really wanted to do something like that. I think, you have that moment as a young kid where you start to attach names with creations.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, Peanuts, oh, it's done by this guy named Schulz, and Calvin and Hobbes by this guy named Watterson. And so and I remember those specials that would come up on TV where, I think there was like a Jim Davis special where he was at his drawing board, and I just wanted to like, understand everything about the tools around him. And then, so documentaries. And so I was just a nerd for all of it, and wanted to be a cartoonist. That ever since I was a kid, that was it. Just wanted to be a cartoonist.
Well, it's so interesting that you say Asterix. That would not have popped out to me initially, but now, of course, that you say it, it's so obvious, something that you would have latched onto and loved. But that's one of the amazing things about cartoons and comics, is that it, by default, all the influences get channeled through a different person and becomes a completely new thing. And that's really interesting to me. That's one of the things I love about comics, is that you're switching from visual world to visual world, and it's completely different, no matter who's being influenced or who's influencing you. So, So when was the first time you then tried to do some comic strips or a comic book story, or like a finished piece that you started showing people and said, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing?
Oh, well, yeah, I think like all of us as kids, we just drew, and some of those early things sort of took more formal shape. And so I would say like I would have been in like 4th or 5th grade when I started to do like a comic strip. And it featured.
Do you remember what it was about? Okay.
Yeah, it featured this platypus character. I think his name was Bertram. Don't know where that name came from. And I hung on to this platypus character, and developed and refined and redrew and redesigned, and he eventually became Plato, and it became a high school comic strip, and then I took it into college, where it became Plato's Republic. Very much like a Pogo, Bloom County, Doonesbury type of strip. Current affairs, young college-aged humor, and that was sort of what I really wanted to get syndicated.
Was that a weekly strip in college?
In college, yeah, it was about as frequently as our newspaper came out, so approximately weekly. So
right.
Yeah, it wasn't. We weren't like we didn't have. When I read about somebody like Jeff Smith, who like did a daily comic strip for the Lantern at his school, we were not. Our production schedule was not that on task.
Yeah, that's how. Yeah, at my college we had a weekly paper, and I did a weekly strip for it. I do envy. I can't imagine I would have successfully been able to do a daily strip in college like Jeff Smith did. That's crazy.
Yeah,
really, really interesting. What do you remember people's reactions to those? Like either
they liked it. I mean, it not too different from that moment where my first image of Charlie Brown as a 6-year-old gets plastered on the wall. Like, people responded to it. And that, of course, just feeds delusions of grandeur, where you're like, oh, yeah, I mean, everybody at my 1,200 person, college loves this strip. I'm going to be a nationally syndicated cartoonist. Of course, that's, meanwhile, as I'm graduating and the career counselors are looking at me dumbfounded, like, okay, kid, whatever. So, and upon graduation, I got myself my first little studio. And that was sort of at the beginning of webcomics.
Right.
And so that's when I started to do it, I think at least 3 times a week, if not daily, online on my own website. And, they remember those website aggregators and just, sharing it and trying to get it out there, and then putting together those syndicate packets every couple of months just to get back the rejection letter. Right. Rightly so, because my stuff was it just wasn't, there. You're just sort of, you're young, you're learning, you're trying to figure it all out. And so, but it was a good training ground. I mean, I realized, having worked for a place like the Schulz Studio and then just being a cartoonist, how hard it is to do a comic strip successfully, and yeah, for lack of a better word, properly. And but I, cut my teeth doing the comic strip. And I think the more I did it, the more I realized, like, oh, my strength is really more in long form. And that shift also, I think, moved with the market, because as I started to develop this other project, this Kid Beowulf thing, just the publishing landscape, newspapers were starting to, close down. Getting syndicated became much more challenging than it already was. And so, self-publishing became a thing, and looking at people like Jeff Smith and just sort of developing longer stories, I just felt more natural. It felt better. I felt like I could do more in sort of comic books and graphic novels. And that's so it was a natural shift in that direction.
Okay, well, let me ask you this. I read an interview with you where you were talking about how one of the things that attracted you to Beowulf is that it's poem. And you found the verse to be visually inspiring and interesting and leaving you enough room to sort of work. So I was sort of wondering, when did you first encounter that, and when did you make the decision to say, oh, I can merge these totally polar opposite things, this sort of mid-century comic sensibility thing with this ancient epic? How did you put those things together?
Yeah, that's a great question. And alongside the track of me just loving all kinds of comics, comic strips, comic books, what have you, as a kid, the other track for me was really diving into the world of mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology, world mythology, those stories of legends and heroes. So they were always sort of concurrent. And so being a nerd for that stuff, when we read Beowulf as an epic poem in, I think it was AP English in my senior year or something, I had read legends before, but they were sort of like novelizations and adaptations. And this was the first time that I'd read it as a poem. And you're right, there was something about that language that sort of, as I've said before, it kind of lit my brain on fire. It was so immediately visual. It was so evocative. It was just, I saw the world just sort of, come to life before me. And so that story in particular, Beowulf, always stuck with me. And in college, what I studied were classics, specifically Greek and Roman stuff. So, nerded out with Homer and Odysseus and those guys. And then, later on, post-college, as I started to figure out what new direction I wanted to go with a longer form storytelling, I came back to Beowulf. And I was just reading it for fun, because that's what people like us do. Mm-hmm. And it sort of seemed funny notion that somebody as big and hulking and sort of 100% warrior as he's presented in the poem, like what would he have been like as a kid? And it was just sort of just a funny kind of notion that started out as like a little zine and then took hold and started to spiral into this much larger tapestry of stories. And yeah, I think because the poem, the way, whether it's the Odyssey or the Beowulf or Gilgamesh or what have you, there is such the language of it is so visual. I mean, that's part of the thing about epic poetry that it lends itself to comics, whether we know it or not. And so, for my particular style, which is a little bit more cartoony, and also my sensibilities were I didn't want to do like just a straight adaptation. I wanted to kind of play with the text and the story, and take in some of those earlier influences, and just kind of create this new, approach to the story that would hopefully lead people back to the original. So it's kind of, I sort of set it up as like a prequel. These are the young adventures of Beowulf and his twin brother Grendel. They travel across the world. They get into other adventures. And it's sort of just, there are hints and suggestions of their future destiny. And it just gives me an opportunity to visit all these different spaces and mythologies and learn about them and have conversations with them through the course of a graphic novel.
Yeah, well, and I'd just like to say too, as a reader of it, I'm not a huge, I didn't care about Beowulf one way or another when I was a kid. So if you're not into that should not turn you off of these books, because they're super fun. They're really sharp. They're a breezy read with beautiful artwork. So it's not, if you're not a Beowulf kind of person, you still would probably enjoy these books, I think. Can you tell me a little bit about your process? That's of course my favorite thing, and I know Michael and Harold love talking about it as well too. And so you can be as get in the weeds as much as possible. How do you produce a page, a chapter, a book, the whole deal? Or you start with
the whole
nothing.
deal. Wow.
You're
okay.
like, all right, I'm gonna have to do another one of these stories.
Boy, how much time your listeners have. But, well, you know how it is. Comics just...
Days.
Right.
They're not doing anything.
Well, if they're like me, they're probably listening to a podcast while they're drawing their comics. I mean, that's one of the key components. Find a great podcast, sit at your drawing table, and
right.
For me, I'm probably at the inking stage at that point. But I do everything as much as I can. I try to emulate my heroes, of course, Schulz being one of them, Jeff Smith being another. You know, the guys who did Asterix. So I like to work with tactile tools. So I draw on Bristol board. I ink with a variety of pens. I've started to get into using the dip brush, the Winsor Newton Sable 7, that whole thing, because, you know, my other heroes like Kelly use that. So I want to get facile with that. A lot of it is just sort of, as you say, it's the process of trying to get better. And that will take a lifetime to sort of understand the thick to thin and how the brush works. But I love that because there's no takebacks. You know, when you're drawing digitally, you have, you know, Command Z at your disposal, and that's not to say I don't use computer. A lot of the post-production stuff that I do is in the computer. I have a colorist. We color digitally. I lay in the text and the word balloons with, you know, those digital tools. So it's kind of half and half, but as much as I try when I'm working on my actual pages, I like to work on 11 by 14 Bristol board. And of course that's working from a script that I've already written out. Yeah. I don't know how you, Jimmy, or Harold or others do it. I know that some will thumbnail and write, you know, those pages as pages and then just sort of refine the art on the board. And I just don't have that facility. I write much better and faster just as a script. And I kind of write it visually and kind of do like, you know, page 1.
Yeah. Do you put notes to yourself? Like, stage direction notes and
so it's, you know, it sort of says page 1, 6-panel layout, such and such is doing this, and sort of describing the scene, characters within it, text within it. And of course that's just a starting point because, you know, I'll do a thumbnail next to it that kind of helps me with the blocking and the staging. And then, of course, when I take it to the artboard, you know, I have a tendency to overwrite. So, you know, when I get to that point where I'm going to kind of give the sense of where the text will be, oftentimes I have to massage that text and whittle it down. And that's just part of the, you know, forever editing, I think, as we create our work.
Right.
And then it goes into the Bristol board, and I pencil everything on 11 by 14 Bristol board with Prismacolor blue pencils. And because I'm a process junkie and I like to leave those pencils, the underdrawing there that I can then ink over.
As a Kelly fan, have you seen the Fanagraphics books that reproduce some of the things on the chapter breaks and stuff like that, where
great.
You see the pencil lines under the ink? It's just so
love all that stuff. And then, you know, then it becomes I'll eventually scan it in, fix all my mistakes as I can with because I'm, you know, on the board, I'm, you know, maybe I'll draw a character a little too big or have to kind of tweak some things. So, you know, those final art pages on the Bristol board, they do, as I said, get tweaked in the digital. You have to clean it up, send those pages to my colorist. He does flats. We kind of go back and forth to get it on model. And then once we're satisfied with the color, I'll start to do the final stage, which is, you know, dropping in the text and sort of going from there. And so that's kind of it in a nutshell. It sounds a lot easier than it is. I wish I was a lot faster than I am. But, you know, I really do love all the stages of creating comics, though. Even what would seemingly be boring of like doing the panels and you know, gridding it out. There's just something really methodical and about that, you know, and it's sort of it's that first stage where you're start to see the page before you, and that it's a kind of a magical experience to take a blank piece of paper and create something and you know, 10, 20 hours later, however long it takes, you've got a little story before you. And it just, I never get tired of that process.
Lex, can I jump in for a second here? This is Harold. Lex, I was wondering, you obviously have experienced both digital and drawing by hand on Bristol board. What is it that keeps you in that world when there's so many things that are trying to pull people into the digital world? What is it that you find out about in the drawing process that really makes that the most satisfying experience for you?
So do you mean like drawing specifically on paper as opposed to drawing on a screen? Yeah.
Right. That you're actually doing the ruling out those panel borders and doing the penciling with the blue pencil and inking on paper versus doing it digitally.
Well, I think clearer, I guess, for lack of a better description. For me, when I'm drawing, a lot of it is just like finding the image. Like I have it in my head, and I know the pose that I want to, put the characters in, but so much of it is just sort of searching on the page. And I'll do that with the underdrawing, with the circles and the cylinders and the motion of the body. And I'm just trying to figure out how it's going to look on the page, where it fits in the plane of that panel. And I just can't do that on a screen. I haven't figured it out, frankly, because I haven't really done it enough. And I know plenty of folks who can draw beautifully on a tablet.
Does that have to do with the just having the entire page spatially always physically present there? Because I know in the digital world you can zoom in on a panel and you're never really getting the full picture and you're coming in and out. Is it that you're living in that world of a piece of paper where this is in this upper left hand corner, you always see it in relation to everything else?
Yeah, that could definitely be
the most satisfying.
And the other thing I love about that aspect of drawing on paper is that the paper tells me when I'm done. It's like when I'm done inking, there's only so much I can do to try and fix, these drawings. There's only so much whiteout I can apply. There's only so much noodling I can do. It sort of forces you to the next page. And there is this kind of momentum that you get, at least I do, when I'm doing a batch of pencils. Again, I don't know how it is for you guys. Like I'm really only good for maybe 10 pages of pencils before like the drawings just start to, fart away. and so then I have to move on to another task, which maybe is starting to ink another batch of pencils. Like I have to kind of shift around the production and give my brain some rest as I'm kind of doing these different tasks. But yeah, Harold, I think you've hit on something in the idea that I see the page before me and I get a better sense of the layout, the characters within it, and how it all operates as a page, not just a panel that perhaps would be, shown on the screen on a sliding scroll or however it's going to be shown online.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. It's something I've kind of wondered myself when I'm working. I've done it obviously both ways, being as old as I am. And I've kind of found the opposite, that I'm so off in relationships of characters or spacing or where I'm composing something that digitally I just get so much help by being able to tweak, move this thing up, change this line, where I can do that over and over again until I kind of get where I need to go. But I get a sense that you have a pretty strong sense of your own drawing style and design, that I get that working in a page, some of my shortcomings, you probably don't have what I have. And it really helps to have that overall sense of where everything is in relationship to everything else. And that is something you lose in digital, at least in my experience.
Well, if that's the case, it's only because I've tricked people. If they saw my penciled pages, they would see it. Like there are oftentimes I'll draw a character and it says like, oh my gosh, that's a great pose. And then I realize that, oh, he's not. Like I get that desire of like, oh, if I could just like shrink him a little bit and move and just slide him over across on the page. But no, I have to erase him and draw it again. So there is something to be said for the facility of digital tools. I mean, they are great, and I don't begrudge anybody to do it however it works for them to get the look they're going for.
Yeah, 100%. But there is something just tactily fun and enjoyable about drawing on paper. I always sort of vaguely resent that, I spent my whole life trying to be a cartoonist, and then there's people constantly telling me ways I can spend less time being a cartoonist. It's like, hey, look, you could do this. Well, I don't want someone to do that.
Yeah.
I don't want a machine to do that. This is what I was trying to do. Well, here's the last cartooning question I have for you. I just want to ask, because you're in a rare position. in that you've been working with a set of characters for a long time, and you've expanded them, and you've gone deeper with them, and you've refined them. And that, Schulz did as well. Can you talk about what it's like to stay with a creative project for so long?
Yeah.
Both the rewards of it and also maybe the downside?
Well, when you ask this question, I immediately think of your own work with Amelia, and I'd love to get your point of view as well. For me, it's kind of like going back to the idea of just learning the tools and the craft and the trade of it, even down to refining what it's like to work with a brush. I'm just trying to get better at drawing these characters and understanding their relationships. And it's so hard to write good stories. That's the other thing I'm always trying to just get better at, how to write better, how to draw better, how to communicate in comics better. So having those characters that I'm familiar with, that I know how they're designed and such, and I can sort of put them in different situations, I think is helpful for me, as opposed to just creating a whole new set of characters or a whole new world. And I have friends who do that, so sort of move from one project to another beautifully. And for me, I think it generally takes longer. I like to sort of, whether it's the right move or not, I stick with a project because I have these grandiose ideas and stories that I want to travel with them. For me, it's very much like a travel log. And so each book, I'm sort of refining and understanding those characters better and learning what I can do to make them a little bit more three-dimensional. And of course, Schulz was great at that. And one of the strips that we'll talk about later, I chose it specifically because he has developed these beautifully three-dimensional characters that I hope I can, create along those lines. When I look at things like what Schulz does, or those great Pixar movies, and the depth that they bring to their characters, that's something I'm definitely striving for.
Yeah, well, it shows on the page. I mean that work is there for the reader, for sure. Yeah, for me, I felt when I was working on Amelia, it getting better and better and better by my own personal standards. Like, I have no idea what a reader would think or a critic would think, but for what I was trying to do, I felt better and better and better at it until I got to the 7th book, and I felt like it, at the very least, it didn't get better. Maybe it got a little worse, you know what I mean? And then I thought, well, that's not a good sign. And also I didn't have fun doing it. So I ended up just doing one more book and then taking some time off and doing, I wrote 1,000 pages for Disney, and I've written and drawn 2 graphic novels for Scholastic. Those characters, even though the one book is completely real, it was a memoir, so they are real people. They're not as real as Amelia, those characters in that book, because they only live in that book. Amelia could do things that contradicted herself because you spent so much time with her. Now that I'm back, I'm working on a new Amelia story right now, and it's like, oh yeah, this is why you do this, because it's like being in a really good band where you just know how everybody else play. I assume I was never in a really good band. I'm a terrible guitarist, but it's how I dream being in a really good band would be.
So wait, can I ask you, did it when you took the break from Amelia and now you're back with it, did the characters feel different at all?
Yeah, I forgot that the only way I could do it is to write it always in her voice, like even if I'm doing notes and stuff like that. So I was trying to like explain it to my agent and some editors and stuff, and trying to write it as if I'm explaining what's going to happen. And it just, because that's how you pitch a regular graphic novel, right? And I thought, I don't know why, it just didn't feel right, and it felt like even the story was off. And then suddenly, when I was just like, no, have her tell the story to even these people, she just came back to life, and then the whole thing was like, oh, okay, I remember how to do this. But it was nicey there for a little bit.
And then let me ask you this also: then, did they want to be drawn differently at all?
Well, yeah, because I set this stupid idea of aging them too, which, because I thought, I mean, clearly Amelia is hugely influenced by Peanuts and all the great kid strips, throughout history. One thing I wanted to do that I thought maybe I could add to it is age her up and see what that's like. Even though it's not going to be something radical, probably like, Maggie from Love and Rockets or something like that. But to watch a kid grow up from 9 to, let's say, graduate in high school or whatever, I think that'll be a cool thing to do. So yeah, so the new version, she's 14, so that's weird. But she still speaks to me in the same way. So that was really cool.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was just gonna say, like the other day, I was thinking, like, one of the things I struggle with is how much do I age my characters throughout the story, and that's sort of an ongoing internal conversation.
Right, because the other thing is the only people that will experience that the growth of the characters in real time are your original readers.
Right.
20 years from now, someone will be they could read them all in a week.
Right.
And I like that's a weird thing with Love and Rockets is that Love and Rockets which is one of my favorite books. I was 15 when I started reading it, and Maggie was like 18 or 19, and we're still that difference in age apart. That's amazing. Right. But that's never going to happen to another generation. They'll read it in a month if they want to, or 2 months, and that's got to be a different feeling entirely.
Yeah, as someone, I just started to dip a toe back into reading some Spider-Man comics because I left for a good 15 years, and reading some recent ones, I'm like, well, wait a minute, where does this work in the timeline? And then realizing, well, there really is no actual timeline, but like, I guess perhaps from his inception at 63 to where we are now is maybe like 10 years of Peter Parker's life,
right?
Which is, a dizzying life. So.
Well, hey, let me ask you this to wrap up here. Tell us a little bit about your work with the Schulz people. That's just an amazing thing. I got to go out there once several years back, and it's just a magical place. And for cartoonists like you who loves it, and it's in your bones and in your blood, it must be a wonderful place to be.
Yeah, no, and I remember your visit. You came as a cartoonist in residence, and it was fun just to show you around the campus. And so I've been at the Schulz Studio. This is my 15th year. I was hired back in January of 2007. And I distinctly remember, my first day on campus. I mean, we call it Snoopy Central because there's a Schulz Museum. And then across the way from the Schulz Museum is the Redwood Empire Ice Arena, also called Snoopy's Home Ice, which is the beautiful ice rink and the Warm Puppy Cafe. And adjacent to that is the Snoopy and Gallery and Gift Shop. So there are these buildings, throughout the space. And then tucked beyond the museum, behind a ball field, is Schulz's original studio. And so for the first half of my career there, that's sort of where I worked alongside the creative director there, Paige Braddock, several other cartoonists.
Another brilliant cartoonist.
Yes, yeah. There were sculptors there. There were accountants there. There were all the people who were there to sort of, continue the Schulz legacy in the empire. A lot of it, still headed up by folks like Jeannie Schulz and Schulz's son Craig, who are very much involved in the day-to-day. And so, yeah, I was hired back then as an approvals coordinator. So what that meant was, there's just so much licensed material. Probably your studios are filled with some kind of Snoopy paraphernalia. And the mandate of the Schulz Studio is to make sure that that material, whether it's a book or a plush or a T-shirt or a mug, looks as good as it can on that product. We kind of preserve the integrity of the image as it gets translated into other media. And we work alongside the New York office, which formerly was the syndicate that Schulz, United Future Syndicate, which sort of, to do its more media related stuff, became United Media. And they did all the business deals and found those licensees for us to work with. So we work alongside them, and when they sold or dissolved the company, I guess would have been in like maybe 2010, a new entity was created called Peanuts Worldwide. And that was done in part by the Schulz family and some other outside investors to sort of continue that business arm to keep those relationships going with our licensees globally. And the Schulz Studio, we continued in basically we're sort of the creative arm, in Schulz's absence. We're there to speak for the strip, to protect the characters, to maintain the integrity of the comic strip, however it manifests, whether it's in a book or as a new animated, Snoopy Show special. Like we're just there at every stage to just, hopefully just do Sparky proud. That's it, So So over the years, as during my tenure as an approvals coordinator, I just found I've always had a love of books and of like the original content and of the strip. And so Paige just sort of realized, okay, I think he'd be really good with books. And she sort of put me on books, and and thankfully that's where I've been and existed. And I work in other content related fields, but my main job as editorial director is to just to work with all the different licensees across the world who create Peanuts publications, from, like the little board books that a publisher might put to all, to the next book that maybe comes featuring original Schulz art. And so all those different iterations and permutations, and I get to work with really talented book designers and writers. And sometimes we have in studio projects. Like for years we did the Peanuts comic books through Boom and the graphic novels, which was a really fun project. So I've just learned so much, and it's been great. And I've gotten to work alongside the museum, in some cases just helping with curatorial stuff or putting some shows together. And I've traveled the world. It's one of those crazy things, because Peanuts is global. We have to sometimes visit places like Japan or Europe and to check in with our licensees. I remember when I first started, Paige said, "Yeah, you work for Peanuts and you see the world," and she wasn't kidding. And it's just been, I can't. It's so weirdly connected to, who I am, I guess, as a cartoonist, because, like I said, I read this eating Cheerios as an 8-year-old. So to be connected to it anyway, and the way that I am is really humbling. And I couldn't ask for a better gig outside of just doing my own work 24/7. It's just been truly life-changing.
Do you feel any affinity with the Midwestern vibe of Peanuts? Because it's interesting how, because of Peanuts, you had a start in the Midwest like Schulz did, but because of Schulz, you wound up in California like Schulz did.
Right.
Do you feel any affinity with the work because of its Midwestern and California roots?
Yes, I think so. And, I think there's definitely a Midwestern vibe to the strip. I remember actually attending a talk a couple of years ago there was a book that came out called The Peanuts Papers. I don't know if you guys have seen it yet, but it's sort of a collection of essays, one of which was written by Jonathan Franzen. And he came to the museum to be interviewed by the editor of that collection. And it was a great conversation, really intriguing to sort of hear both of them talk about Peanuts. But at one point, he was asked if he thought Peanuts had a particular Midwestern flair to it. And Franzen just sort of poo-pooed that idea and didn't think it at all
Really
had it. And I just disagree. I just feel like it's very much there.
I would agree too. Yeah. Because I had family in Missouri and Oklahoma, but we moved around. I was in DC area as a little kid, and then Rochester, New York, and then back to mid-Missouri and Columbia by the time I was 11. And I definitely felt it was it's a different culture, and there's this kind of, I don't know, an integrity, a self-imposed integrity in the strip, which reminds me so much of Midwestern upbringing. And then having worked on Mystery Science Theater with Joel, who was in, they made it in Minneapolis, right next to where Schulz grew up, and the feel of that, there is a feel to it. It is maybe hard to put a finger on what exactly it is, but it seems to have a certain type of restraint and integrity to it. It's like they create boxes for themselves to work in, and then they because of that, it has a different feel, and they work brilliantly in the boxes they create, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the best word that comes to mind for me is sincerity. There's just a sincerity to Peanuts, and also, if you think you just hit the nail on the head. The idea of boxes, like here he is in 1950, given his live stream to do a comic strip, and they give him the smallest real estate possible, like these 4 rinky-dink boxes where his heroes are doing like full page spreads and massive, real estate. And he's like, oh, man, okay, well, but he's not going to complain. He's just trying to figure it out. Like, how do you even do a gag in 4 panels that, I can barely draw in, which is partly one of the reasons I think he drew so big. Like, if you've seen his originals, he was going to be shrunk down, so he sort of had to production-wise draw big. But I also feel like he wanted to draw that big because he was relegated to the smallest piece of real estate in the newspaper. So yeah, but there's definitely a sincerity to what he does, and what I also think is perhaps Midwestern. It's not so much self-effacing, but he always talked about in his interviews trying to create a really good feature, so for the editor, so they could sell more newspapers. It was just like that was kind of it for him, and all these other things that I think later auteur cartoonists, people like Breathitt and maybe Bill Watterson, where they started to demand things, like I want to take a sabbatical or I want to do this or that. Like, that would have been unheard of for somebody like Schulz. I think, generationally, it was like this was his job. This is what he was
like an
tasked
ethic
to do.
there.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's not to say that those guys didn't have, that's the same kind of work ethic, but it's also like,
it's a way of seeing and that affects what you do and don't do.
Right.
So thank you for coming on the show. How about we talk about your big? Oh wait, no, I have a new segment. I want to ask every cartoonist the same 5 questions. So this is without you thinking. This is just off the top of your head. I want you to answer these questions about being a cartoonist. First thing that comes to your mind.
Okay.
What's the best part of being a cartoonist?
Boy, I guess the first thing that came to mind is just drawing the pages, and when a page looks good.
What's the worst part?
I guess now the thing that I find hard to do is just the promotion, like whatever we're supposed to do with making people find our work, read our work, social media, stuff like that.
Right. What comic would I most be surprised to find in your collection?
I'm looking at my collection right now, trying to see what might be weird. The thing that pops out is Vinland Saga, which is I've just started to dip a toe into manga, and that is a manga by a cartoonist named, I think I'm going to butcher his name, Mamoto Yukimura, and it's just a terrific 12-volume ongoing story about the Vikings. So maybe it's not the weirdest thing, but it's beautifully done, and it's just it's really inspiring just to sort of get when you find a new series that you really latch onto. Yeah, that's that kind of feeling.
What's the one undisputed comics classic that you just don't get?
Man, this is tough.
You can pass if you want.
Let's come back to that one. I might have to think about that.
All right. Charles Schulz is the greatest cartoonist of all time. Who is the second greatest?
Oh, okay. Well, Walt Kelly comes to mind, I guess. And I would say visually he is.
It's a good pick.
Yeah. And I guess what I would say to that earlier question was years ago it would have been Prince Valiant as, a great strip, a classic that, everybody lauded. But I never quite got into, but I actually have been rereading it through Fantagraphics, and it's extraordinary. So that's how much I know.
All right. Well, you've grown as a person, so that's right. A good thing. That is awesome. Well, Lex, thank you so much for doing this. Hey, everybody out there, thanks for listening. Why don't we just take a break, and then we'll come right back, and we'll talk about Lex's pick for 5 favorite Peanut strips. And we're back. We're here with Alexis Fajardo, who is going to pick his top 5, not necessarily top 5, but 5 fascinating Peanut strips for us to discuss. Again, I'm Jimmy. I'm here with Michael and Harold. Lex, tell us, what was your criteria for selecting these 5 strips?
Yeah, well, we exchanged some email back and forth, and when you told me, like, okay, I want you to pick 4 favorite strips, I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. I can rattle these off the top of my head. And then as I started to think about it, it became more and more difficult because as you guys are discovering in your read through, like there's so many good strips and from all different eras. And so I just started to think, okay, how do I find strips that mean something to me as a cartoonist? The strips that I sort of think about from time to time that sort of just pop into my head as like, oh, that's just a funny gag, or Schulz is doing just a great thing as a cartoonist. So I just sort of tried to, and I also wanted to find strips that I thought could maybe lead to discussion about, it maybe not be the best Flying Ace strip, but at least we can talk about his work as the Flying Ace and just how he delves with character and how he writes gags. And so, yeah, I think ultimately, if you were to ask me next week, pick your next favorite 5, I would find another bunch to talk about, and they'd be just as edifying. For this particular podcast, these are the ones I landed on. These are the ones that I think about, that make me smile, and that I thought there was plenty to chat about.
Awesome. That's great. Well, let's get to it, guys. August 6, 1973. Snoopy is perched atop his doghouse, typing away at his typewriter. This is what he writes. Though her husband often went on business trips, she hated to be left alone. I solved our problem, he said. I bought you a St. Bernard. Its name is Great Reluctance. Now, when I go away, you shall know that I am leaving you with great reluctance. Snoopy finishes his passage by writing, she hit him with a waffle iron. All right, that's your first pick of your 5 peanut strips. What is it about this one that spoke to you?
Yeah, so this one is just one of those strips that technically it's beautifully lettered, and it's done in that it's Schulz writing in that typewriter font that he's got, and so it's done really well. But more than that, it's just funny to me. It's just one of those stupid, funny strips that Schulz did, and he could only really ever get away with when Snoopy is as the author sitting atop his doghouse. This stupid sort of pun wouldn't work in any other instance. And I kind of like that. I mean, a dog named Great Reluctance. It's just so dumb. I love it. It's just one of those guilty pleasures, and I always just get a kick out of this one. So
we're up to 1955 in our reading, just about to start 1966, and he would have. In the earlier period, he would have done something like given this to Charlie Brown, as Charlie Brown is like trying to be a cartoonist.
Mm-hmm.
And those always just don't have the level of ironic remove that makes it work by having it be the dog typing it on his doghouse.
Yeah.
I don't know why that makes it a better remove to make it funnier, but it just does.
Well, I was wondering about that because I'm looking at all of these in the context of where we're at now, which is 1955, and trying to think, okay, would he have done this in the mid 50s? And that led me to think we have something called the Shermy test, which is basically, would the gag work with another character? Right. If it's specific to the character, then it passes the Shermy test. And if Shermy said it, it probably wouldn't be funny. I wonder about this one because when I saw this, I thought, would this be funny if that, like just what Jimmy said, if Charlie Brown had, this was the comic strip he wrote, and he's reading it to Linus or something, would that be funny, or is this specific to Snoopy?
I think it is. I don't know why. I can't put my finger on exactly why. But it feels like it is,
right?
Because it's a joke,
right?
It's just a flat joke, and not a good
joke,
and not a good joke.
And that's for me part of the humor is that, I mean, Schulz knows it's not a great joke, but he's that last panel she hit him with the waffle iron. That's
talking about sincerity.
It's
you
also,
talk about sincerity.
Yeah,
Snoopy seems to be writing this with tremendous sincerity, and yet he knows it's a joke. It plays with your mind.
Yeah. Yeah, and just the idea that there's this scenario of
at least Snoopy's not smiling.
A husband and a wife. Like the kids don't, I think, relate to the world that way. So you've got this character Snoopy who I think can he is removed, like you said, Jimmy, and these sorts of gags, he would do them every now and then. I just think they're, like I said, stupid funny.
So good. February 28th, 1973. Snoopy and Charlie Brown are sitting outside. Snoopy is examining a piece of paper. Charlie Brown says to him, "To be eligible for the Daisy Hill Puppy Cup, nominee must fill out the enclosed form." Charlie Brown is reading the form over Snoopy's shoulder. We see the first question, which is name of owner. Snoopy sits thinking a little too long. In panel 3, Charlie Brown angrily says, "Charlie Brown." In panel 4, Snoopy turns back to his form to fill it out. He thinks to himself, how embarrassing.
This is really strange because the great mystery of the first year or so is who owns Snoopy.
Mhm.
Longer, really.
Yeah, because Jimmy pointed out in 55 again, there was the first strip, we think, that explicitly shows that Charlie Brown owns Snoopy. And there's all kinds of hints to the contrary in the earlier strips. This implies that Snoopy doesn't know who owns it.
It's that he never remembers his name.
The round-headed kid.
Yeah.
The round-headed kid, he always calls him in the later strips.
Yeah. And I chose this one because I'm a dog person. I love dogs. I have a dog. I have a voice for my dog. I think he thinks these wonderful thoughts. And this just illustrates it's just sort of, it's a little more, colder than that. And what's also fun is if, when folks look at this visually, is the pacing is terrific. You see Charlie Brown angrily stating his name. And then that final panel, he's just got this kind of frown on him. It's like, this is my dog. He doesn't even know who I am. And I love in the second panel, Schulz again plays with that, typography. And you have it says name of owner and there's a dash. And it's as if you're seeing it on the form that Snoopy is filling out. And I really like those strips where he does that sort of thing, where he plays with typography, where the kids are like writing letters and you see their handwriting scrawled above in the panel. And that's just so unique. I don't think you can do that in any other form but a comic strip. And it's just really interesting to me. And so this is just another one that I think is really funny, and it illustrates the relationship between these two characters. And it's just pretty biting.
And some classic art too. I mean, this early mid 70s version of Charlie Brown and Snoopy resonates with me as a kid I was 7 at the time this came out. And so this version of Peanuts really resonates. And I just think his line work and the character design is amazing.
Gorgeous stuff.
So this is pretty much the Snoopy who persists throughout the 70s and 80s, because we're just getting into the long-nosed balloony Snoopy from the mid-50s, and I'm trying to keep an eye on how he progresses to this look.
Lex, we actually literally think we may have pointed out one specific panel where his snout elongates and it stays that way for like the next year. We talked about the punctuation in a strip for about 20 minutes. We are going into real detail.
Into the weeds.
December 22nd, 1962. We see 3 identical panels of Charlie Brown and Linus sitting on the curb, their head in their hands. Finally, in panel 4, Charlie Brown stands up and yells to the sky, "Why couldn't McCovey have hit the ball just 3 feet higher?"
This was really important to me.
We have an ongoing segment called Peanuts Obscurities Explained, and I think this would qualify for that.
Michael, do you want to explain this one?
So you guys do not understand this?
I understand it, but only because I looked up when I was reading through the Fantagraphics books the first time. I looked up to see what it was.
This was like my life. I grew up in LA, so of course everybody I knew was a Dodger fan. I decided at age 9 to be a Giants fan. And I became totally obsessed. It was like my greatest love was the Giants. And in 1962, they got into the World Series, amazingly, against the Yankees. And, in my lifetime, the Giants had never been in the World Series. And, of course, they were underdogs. But they managed to get to Game 7 and only 1 run behind in the bottom of the 9th. Correct me, some baseball fans out there, correct me if I'm wrong on the details. But basically, I think they had runners on second and third with 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth, which meant any single or
Wins the
any
game.
hit would bring in the 2 runners. They'd win the World Series. And their second best hitter, or third best maybe, came up, Willie McCovey, and hit the screaming line drive. I was watching this on TV, and at that moment, it's like, they won! And the second baseman for the Yankees, Bobby Richardson, jumped up and caught it.
Yeah.
And so it went from like absolute ecstasy to like total like pain and failure in like a half a second.
Yeah.
But it's funny, I remember this strip. I was just telling Harold this story before we started. I said, yeah, it was amazing because like that's how I felt. And then the next day I read Peanuts and there it was. And clearly the date is 12/22.
Right.
It's 2 months later.
And that's the thing. Like, yeah, Michael, your play-by-play is perfect.
Is it right?
Yeah. I think. Well, so I'm much younger. I grew up as a lifelong Red Sox fan, but somebody who has felt the pain, and now I've sort of, the second team would be the Giants. But I love this strip because, again, it's one of those visual ones. You kind of have to look at it, and as Jimmy described it, it's 3 identical panels. Charlie Brown, Linus sitting at the curb. They're not changing. Their expressions are the same. They're lost in thought. They're lost in deep thought. And then that final panel, Charlie Brown screams to the heavens about, McCovey hitting that just 3 feet higher. And it's just like, as a baseball fan, I totally get this. And then as a cartoonist, I think it's really kind of a bold, gag to do. I mean, it's so specific. And the other thing I love is the date. Like, Michael, you call it the date, the 22nd of December, the same year. So that just sort of puts in my head, like, these kids have been there for months just thinking about this play, and it just makes it all the more perfect. And that's, all of these strips, I think, the other thing I wanted to point out is that the humor is in the specificity, and he's so good at like being specific about whatever topic it is.
Yeah. Well, there are quite a few that we're hitting from the early years that we have no idea what he's talking about. Or at least not all of us will know. I mean, Terhune, it keeps like that's the famous one. Who the punchline, the gag had something to do with some guy named Terhune, and
Albert Payson Terhune. He wrote "Lad a Dog."
We had no idea who it was.
Harold knew, of course. And Michael,
very specific.
Like Michael said, it was a screaming line drive. You should check it out. It's on YouTube. It is hit hard. That baseball was smoked.
I still, my stomach still hurts. We discussed that mouth in the last panel in our last podcast, and I brought up the fact that I thought that was from Little Lulu. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Interesting. I'm not that familiar with Little Lulu, so I wouldn't be able to know, but he drew the same kind of expression.
Yeah, she tends
I think they had the thing with the nose on top and that big black mouth. I think that's how they expressed their angst.
Schultz's is slightly more abstract, and the Little Lulu one's slightly more geometric because that's just the nature of it. But yeah, there's definitely a similarity.
Interesting.
August 11th, 1966. Snoopy, dressed as the World War I flying ace, is sitting in what looks like a hovel. There is a wooden table in front of him. Snoopy thinks to himself, here's the World War I flying ace, talking with his commanding officer. Snoopy rolls out a map on the table. On our left is Saint Mihiel. On our right is Pont-a-Mousson. Intelligence reports that an ammunition train is at the railway station in Longuyon. Our bombers cannot get through, but one lone airplane flying very low just might make it. Snoopy bravely salutes and says, I, of course, volunteer.
This is sort of the period where I thought, this is totally subjective, of course, and everybody has their favorite period probably when they were a certain age. I felt that at this point with the continuing strips, the jokes weren't as sharp, or maybe no jokes at all. I mean, there is really no joke in this strip.
And part of the reason I chose it was I'm a huge fan of the Flying Ace, just as a character. I think he's terrific. And I chose this one just because artistically, I really like how it's drawn.
Mm-hmm.
And, Jimmy, as you described, the room that Snoopy is in, and then sort of the spotlight shadow in the second panel, and his very determined, serious expressions throughout the whole thing. And the other reason I chose it was because Schulz was able to do everything he wanted to do in his comic strip. If he wanted to do an adventure strip, he has it this way with the Flying Ace. If he wanted to do a relationship, he has it with some of those other characters. Like, there wasn't anything he couldn't tackle or make work within the confines of these 4 panels. And I think this one in particular illustrates that idea of, like, yeah, if he wanted to do an adventure strip, Schulz could have done one.
Yeah.
And the versatility of that was what I kind of wanted to, highlight in this strip in particular. It's just sort of like, whether it's Flying Ace or French Foreign Legion or any of the myriad personas.
Do you know when he first started showing what was in Snoopy's imagination? Because we haven't come across that yet. The fact that he's not sitting on the doghouse. This is not.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
You're seeing the room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose those first, I don't know for sure, but in terms of the Flying Ace, like, he did show the bullet holes on the side of the doghouse. And there's some great Sundays where, around this period, maybe a couple of years before, he's going through the French countryside, and so we see the hay bales and we see the Eiffel Tower. And so I think he certainly did it with him as a Flying Ace. I don't know if that's where it started, but yeah, I just love how he was able to just kind of, make the strip do whatever he wanted to do and make it work.
Mm-hmm. The Flying Ace thing just really caught on, and I don't know, boosted it to a new level of popularity, if that was possible. I mean, with a hit pop song and everything.
Yeah.
But he did veer from sort of his own rules that he'd set up to that point by doing the adventure strip.
Well, this is interesting. I'm glad that you picked these next 2 strips, Lex, because I have this map in my head of Peanuts and what it is and what it becomes. And this is, which I've not really been able to get into in the show because, of course, we're reading them in order and we're only in 1955. But I was really influenced by the book Good Grief by Rita Grimsley Johnson, I think her name is. And she has a chapter in it called Neighborhoods. And in it, she talks about how there's the original classic neighborhood, good old Charlie Brown. There's Snoopy's neighborhood, which is, his imagination. And there's, as we're going to see in the next strip you picked, Peppermint Patty's neighborhood. And I think what really happens is Peanuts stops being a comic strip about good old Charlie Brown, and it becomes this umbrella that contains basically these 3 entire separate artistic works that somehow come together. Mm-hmm. And so it's because it's all it ever has been and all it ever will be is a direct communication from Schulz to you. He's never breaking any rules because he's not making the Marvel Comics universe. Or writing poetry, and he's just ever expanding all the notes that he can play on his keyboard to mix a metaphor, or learn better words for his poetry, and they all come together. But they can also all work separately. I think you could make a case that the best comic strip of all time is Peanuts, the second best is Snoopy, and the third is Peppermint Patty.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I love that what Grimsley Johnson talks about, and she also talks about many of the themes he touches on, and how he just plays with those themes throughout the course of the 50 years. Like he revisits the Flying Ace in the 90s. I mean, throughout, from its inception all the way through. And there's just like these slight, gradations and playing with how Snoopy interacts, and his, and he does that with each, whether it's Flying Ace or all the characters or Kiting a Tree or, Lucy in the football. He's just always just doing these other riffs, and they're always really funny, and they're always very specific to whatever decade he happens to be in. Like whatever his, he as a person has changed and is changing, and that's always ever present in the strip.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well said. June 22nd, 1972. Peppermint Patty is sitting in the grass. She's speaking to someone. She says, "I stood in front of that little red-haired girl, and I saw how pretty she was." We now see that she's speaking with Linus. She continues, "Suddenly, I realized why Chuck has always loved her, and I realized that no one would ever love me that way. I started to cry, and I couldn't stop. I made a fool out of myself, but I didn't care. I just looked at her, and I cried and cried and cried." Peppermint Patty buries her face in her hands and says, "I have a big nose, and my split ends have split ends, and I'll always be funny looking, and I think I'm going to cry again."
Yeah.
All right, tell us about that, Lex.
So this one just breaks my heart.
Yeah.
And I just love Peppermint Patty is probably my favorite character. And she's, like I mentioned before, like all the characters are really well developed. They're three-dimensional. They have internal thoughts and emotions and whatnot. And this strip just sort of illustrates just how good Schulz was at delineating character and yeah, you read this strip and how can you not feel sorry for Peppermint Patty? How have we not ourselves felt something like that? He just captures that so beautifully. And I just wanted to, point this one out because I just feel like he's such a good writer and really digs deep with this character in particular.
Yeah, that's an amazing strip. Jimmy's thought of that. This is actually a separate strip in a way. It makes me look at it in a different way, rather than this is not following the formula, which is Charlie Brown is miserable, but it's always funny.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that he's doing this is like kind of startling. I've never seen this one before.
Yeah, and in one of our earlier episodes, we were talking about the golf strip where Lucy goes to the golf tournament and there's all the people. And previous to that, Harold noticed that Schulz also has a gag about human interest strips, which I'd never heard that term before. I always thought of them as soap opera strips or whatever. But he is sort of Peppermint Patty. It almost is like a prototype of a YA comic. People always talk about the influence Schulz had on me, and they always say Lucy and stuff. But Amelia's most direct antecedent in Peanuts is Peppermint Patty.
Mm. Yeah,
I love this strip.
Yeah, it's just great. And the other thing I love, like you said, like the Peppermint Patty and her neighborhood is a separate universe. And as you say, it dips in and out with Charlie Brown and his gang but that he can have these fully formed characters and just living their lives and then intersecting wherever he wants is great. And you're right, there's no gag to this. It's just, which is also, I think, what years is this? 72. So yeah, I think one of the reasons I like the 70s a lot is that he's just writing stories. He's doing what he wants to do. He's at the top of his game, supremely confident in his writing and his drawing, and you just see it in the strips. I don't know how this would have, and I suppose actually if you're reading this as it came out in the newspaper, you'd be on the hook. You'd want to know what happens the next day. Does this get resolved? So again, like just a real master of the form.
Yeah, going back to I can only talk about like three things, Lex. I could talk about baseball, I could talk Peanuts, I could talk about the Beatles. That's about it. But I read an interview years ago with Greg Maddux, who was the pitcher for the Braves, and he talks about how he wasn't a fastball pitcher, but he's like, fastball pitchers are great, but once you see a guy throw a fastball at you, you're not impressed the next time. It's just a pitch, right? Even though the pitcher is doing something that's superhuman. He's throwing a baseball 100 miles an hour into a strike zone, right? But you've seen it once. I think because Schulz has been brilliant for 22 years by the time this strip comes out, it's like, oh, well, okay. But in reality, this is radical.
Mm-hmm.
This is radical.
Yeah. And that's the other thing when I think about the other cartoonists that we've already talked about in the the course of the podcast. People like, Breathed, and the other superstar, Bill Watterson, of course, Gary Larson. These guys in the 80s, they did it for just 10 years. That's what boggles my mind. It's like, for whatever reason, there was burnout. They wanted to move on. They done their stint. But if you think about 10 years for Schulz, that just barely gets us, to the end of 59. Snoopy has just sort of started to climb on top of his doghouse. Like, can you imagine if he stopped then? Like, well, we wouldn't be talking. We wouldn't have having this podcast for sure. Peanuts would have just been some weird little strip, little relic in the past. And every decade is just another, just amazing look at this guy who's just telling the story, and that's what I love about it. And that's what I think when I think of my time at the studio, like the most important publications we've done are these Fantagraphics books. Like Gary Groth and his team, man, thank the Lord that he and Jeannie Schulz did this project, because it's so massively important to be able to read the strip front ways and back ways and sideways and understand it from all these different angles and the context of who he was as his life, and what other strips happened to be on the page in 1972. And it just sort of, for me, it always opens up like different ways to think about what he was doing as an artist.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
no one else could have gotten away with this.
No.
I mean, imagine Nancy doing this monologue here.
You would think you would call for a welfare check on Ernie Bushmiller. You'd be like, what is going on? So Lex, thanks for being with us. Is there anything else you'd like to promote? Where can people follow you online?
Well, I would direct folks to, if they want to learn more about my work, the graphic novel series Kid Beowulf, they can go to kidbeowulf.com, where new comics will be happening weekly, sharing new material there. Books are available online there as well. If you do the Twitter and the Instagram, I'm at Lex Fajardo Art, so you can follow me there. Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you guys inviting me on. It's always fun to talk shop, to talk Peanuts, to chat with our artists who are just as engaged with Schulz's stuff as I am. So thank you.
It was a total pleasure and just a thrill.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Lex.
All right, everybody, we'll be back in a couple weeks. Until then, I'm Jimmy Gownley for Michael Cohen and Harold Buchholz. Be of good cheer.
Unpacking Peanuts is copyright Jimmy Gownley, Michael Cohen, and Harold Buchholz. Produced by Liz Sumner. Music by Michael Cohen. Additional voiceover by Aziza Shakrala Clark. For more from the show, follow Unpack Peanuts on Instagram and Twitter. For more about Jimmy, Michael, and Harold, visit unpackingpeanuts.com. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for listening.
You blockhead!